Good evening and welcome back to our analysis of this year's budget. It's a budget that's set to change the path of the Indian economy, no less. Let's have a quick recap of the main points in the budget so far. The rupee has been made partially convertible. 60% of foreign earnings will now be convertible at market rates. Income tax rates have been reduced. Exemption limit has been raised from 22,000 to 28,000. The maximum tax rate is 40% plus a 12% surcharge. Sweeping delicensing of imports. All non-essential imports will now be on OGL, but they have to be paid for out of foreign exchange to be bought at market rates. Exim scrips will be replaced, but we've heard in this interim that they will still be honored, those who have them. The special excise tax rate raised by 5%. Now that's a rate on the excise you're already paying. So if you're paying 20%, it's 5% on 20%, raising your rate to 21%. Gold import scheme announced. Attack on smuggling. Returning Indians and NRIs can now bring a certain amount of gold and pay a duty on that in foreign exchange. There are major changes in wealth tax and capital gains tax, which will take, I think, accountants some time to actually figure out exactly what's happened. But the wealth tax maximum rate is now at 1%. And in capital gains, the cost of assets are to be indexed to inflation. The interest rates have been cut by 1% as a boost to industry, particularly investment. Foreign investors, the company tax rates have remained unchanged, and foreign investors actually can now invest in shares in the stock market. I can add that as another main point. Customs duties have been lowered across the board. Cigarettes, chocolates, watches, LCVs, two-wheelers are to cost more. Petrol and diesel have been spared, and both the fiscal and the budget deficit targets have been met for last year, and for next year it's 5%. That's again a substantial cut. We have with us the Finance Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who has just come out of the Parliament, and we are very honored to have him here, and we do have a lot of questions for you, sir. First of all, how would you describe this budget in terms of its main thrust?
Prannoy, we are in a phase of restructuring our economy, of ensuring that the grave economic crisis which we faced when our government came into office is converted into an opportunity to give our economy a new sense of direction, so that growth rate can be accelerated, employment opportunities can grow at a faster rate, that our country is enabled to launch a second industrial revolution, a second agricultural revolution, that our country is enabled to integrate itself into the world economy in a manner in which we can take advantage of the opportunities offered by the new global economy while minimizing the risks of participation to the maximum extent possible. It is a budget which at the same time seeks to ensure that the process of restructuring must be such that it does not impose undue burdens on the poorer sections of our society. We are committed to ensuring that in the process of restructuring, the interests of the working classes, both in the organized sector and in the unorganized sector, will be fully protected. We will make every effort that the potential offered by our agriculture to increase productivity, income and employment, and to increase exports is fully realized.
So on that particular point, I want to ask you about protecting the people of this country from the trauma of change. I mean, we're seeing it in many parts of the world, change, and we're seeing trauma that people are going through. Specifically on prices, that has been a reaction after the budget. What have you done in this budget to make sure that prices don't accelerate or inflation doesn't accelerate?
As I've been saying, the single most important factor to control inflation is to gain mastery over India's fiscal system, that we must curb both the monetized deficit as well as the fiscal deficit. Now, there are economists who would say that monetized deficit is more important, and I personally agree with them. We have cut the monetized deficit, we will cut it further. But I believe that rightly or wrongly, many people believe that the overall fiscal deficit is also important in fanning inflationary expectation. So, we must walk on both the legs. We must reduce the monetized deficit, we must also seek to reduce the overall fiscal deficit. This process we began last year. We had promised to reduce it to a certain level. We have fulfilled that promise. We must improve upon that performance in the course of next year. I am confident that if we persevere in that direction, inflationary expectations would get a beating. The second thing is that now that our reserves are much more comfortable, supply management can take on a more purposeful role. We can today import many commodities which we were not able to do so only 3 or 4 months ago. That also should help to break inflationary expectation. Furthermore, the reduction in customs duties that I have announced by lowering the cost of new investment projects would also help to break this psychology of a high cost economy, that every cost of production
but will the
every year must go
on. That's if these industrialists pass on the lower cost that they get, and a more competitive environment will virtually force them to.
And therefore, the move towards partial convertibility, the move towards internal delegation and the internal competition will force industrialists to share the gains of productivity with the consumers. Also, the scope for monopolistic profits in industry, the rents that arise in restricted regimes, I think those would be eliminated over a period of time. All this would strengthen the disinflationary forces.
Just one more thing on deflationary forces and industrialists. I think industry has seen its worst year in terms of a credit squeeze, in terms of a recession. What is there in your budget which they should look for to see that there's going to be a little more relaxation of that this year?
I have already begun the process by reducing the interest rates, the floor levels by 1%. I believe we can do more in months to come, and I have been saying all along that real rates of interest in our country should no higher than 2%. If we succeed in inflation, reducing the inflation rate significantly, as I expect will happen, unless we are unlucky with regard to the weather cycle, then we will be able to reduce interest rates in a big way.
We have the same panel as we had earlier, who I know are itching to ask questions. Ninan, I can see you absolutely longing to get clarifications and policy questions. I think we can widen the kind of questions to a broader issue of the thrust of the whole. Do you have any particular thing which you like to ask right now?
I have one specific clarification to ask, which is that the budget assumes a reduction in the overall subsidy bill. I don't see any price measures in the budget which will actually bring that subsidy reduction about. There is some kind of reference to the fertilizer pricing issue in the Finance Minister's speech, and the question is whether a fertilizer price increase should be expected in the near future.
Well, let me say that we are determined to keep fertilizer subsidy within the limits that I have indicated in my budget. There are several methods of bringing that about. Changes in prices are only one of them. For example, we have today a system whereby the more you import, the more the subsidy. So therefore, subsidies are a function also of what happens to the import front. Now, what quantity we will import is also a function of what happens to domestic production. So we have several options. Our government has a viewpoint, but there is a parliamentary committee under Shri Pratap Rao Bhonsle, and I think in deference to that committee, I thought we must wait before we take a final view on this matter. But our commitment to contain fertilizer subsidies at the figure that I have mentioned is firm.
Actually, in the previous year's budget, the revised figures, the subsidy levels were higher than you had budgeted.
Yes.
So are they a little bit ambitious still this year, and do you think you will actually slip a bit on that front?
Well, let me say that I am hopeful that I will improve upon what I have promised. I think nothing succeeds like success. If the budget that I have presented to this country, if it meets with general approval, I think the people in India are prepared to make sacrifices if they know that these sacrifices are for worthwhile causes. I have tremendous faith in the people of India, and therefore, if the overall strategy meets with the approval of the country, if they find that here is a government honestly trying to cope with these formidable economic challenges, maybe imperfectly, maybe haltingly in some direction, I do believe we will get the support of the people. We will create an environment in which, working together with our people and Parliament, we will take sensible decisions.
Dr. Singh, your gold import scheme, do you see it as a means to attack smuggling or end smuggling? And number two, the convertibility of the rupee or the partial convertibility, do you see that putting an end to what is known as the Hawala market in foreign exchange?
Well, first of all, let me say, I think gold, one has to operate to curb smuggling. You have to operate both on the supply side and the demand side. We are not in a position to use our own foreign exchange to allow import of gold, but we know that certain amount of gold comes in. So we are allowing non-residents to make profits in an honest way, so as to augment the supply of gold. To the extent the difference between the internal price of gold and the external price of gold goes down as a result of this, I think the incentive for smuggling would also go down. Secondly, on the supply side, certain transactions which feed this smuggling of gold, remittances. Now, we have created a situation where those who bring remittances into our country can get a much better rate of exchange, and this would therefore reduce the incentive.
That would be my question. What is the rate of exchange that you would expect on the open market for the rupee vis-a-vis, let's say, the US dollar?
Well, let me say, I mean, in all these matters, one has to be humble because one can never predict the future. But I would roughly say that I think a premium of about 15% over the official exchange rate would roughly be right.
I think expectations on that the market kind of
operators
will actually, in fact, there is an entire package on the foreign sector. If I can quickly run through a summary of that, then I can get a reaction on the overall package on that. On the foreign sector, basically there have been 5 or 6 combination of factors that have come together. For example, there's, as I mentioned earlier, partly convertible rupee will replace the Exim scrip. All non-bulk items will be de-licensed. They'll now be on OGL, and foreign exchange for this will need to be bought at market rates. All private travel, debt service, dividends, royalties will be paid in foreign exchange bought at market rates. After that, there's a gold import policy which we've just discussed, where up to 5 kgs each passenger can bring in at a duty of 450 rupees per 10 kg, payable in foreign exchange again. Customs duties have been lowered right across the board on capital goods, but no change in consumer goods imports. Tarun, you had a specific question on these capital goods. Specifically, actually now, the finance minister has said that he has tremendous faith in the people of India, and I think the biggest pressure out of liberalizing or opening up the economy to competition, the biggest pressure is going to come on industry. Can Indian industry respond after years of collecting rent and licenses and making money in not exactly competitive conditions?
Prannoy, when we listen to the budget each year, we have 2 columns. We have a column for plus points and we have a column for minus points. And it was very difficult as one went along listening to the finance minister's speech to find minus points. So that's a very categorical statement on the budget.
Normally your minus points, have you been on this program before?
That's
I've seen
right.
the list longer.
Yes, very few.
But isn't there one big
there
minus?
are 1 or 2 questions to ask the finance minister, but not minus points really. And I think this confidence, the budget is giving us confidence. And I think Indian industry has been seeking a more competitive environment. I think the budget is doing that. You had a question about whether the benefit of customs duty reductions will be passed on. Yes, because the investment cost will come down and all of that will have a chain effect down the line. I just had one question, that when we look ahead to the next year and we look at investments, the finance minister has talked about the capital goods duty down. Was there some reason which we are not aware of or not clear about why the depreciation allowance could not go back to the old level? Was that a major problem to promote investment? And the second question is, do you see this budget promoting exports?
Well, I think certainly this budget gives a big boost to exports. I think we have removed most obstacles involved in the bureaucratic processes of providing incentive for exports. And if the market exchange rate settles at a reasonable premium, as I expect, all this will provide a generalized incentive for exports of the type both of goods and services, which has not been there in our country. With regard to the investment allowance, now let me say that we will do everything to help our industry to compete effectively. That is a commitment I own up. I could have done something in this budget, but I did not have the report of the Chalia committee before me, and therefore I thought that maybe I should wait for their considered recommendations before plunging into this area. But that I as finance ministry have an obligation to see that Indian industry's hands are strengthened to compete effectively against foreign firms in our country. I think that is a commitment I own.
But
Do you think Indian industry will respond? Sorry.
Is there really the exposing of Indian industry to greater foreign competition? Because if you assume a 15% premium in the open market for the dollar, and if your customs tariff on average has come down by about 20-25%, and given the overhang of the past depreciation, which was not neutralized through customs duty reduction, you have not really reduced the effective levels of protection for the Indian economy. I mean, it is still as protected, if not more protected, than 18 months ago.
Well, I think that's only time will tell what premium rates are going to be. Let me say that I am committed to further reducing the customs duty. My only worry this time was about the revenue implications. If I had more foreign exchange to play with, so that imports could be relied upon to a much larger degree than I anticipate, I could have been bolder. Also, I have to worry about the health of India's capital goods industries, particularly in the background of the worldwide deflationary pressures. I don't want that there should be a dumping of foreign goods into our countries. We must liberalize at a pace at which we can sustain. After all, it is only 8 months that I have been telling Indian industry that they have to prepare themselves. I have given them notice now that I propose to do more, and this next 1 or 2 years, Indian industry must do its own arithmetic to prepare itself for the global market. Whatever help it needs from the government in this process, we are committed to providing that.
So basically the market forces, yes, Geeta.
No, if I can supplement what Ephraim said, just a minor mistake in your arithmetic, Ninan. If we reduce customs duty, let us say by 20%, you are trying to set off 15% of the PCR. Today for the same import you are willing to pay 25% in the EXIM route. So the transition from EXIM to PCR will get you a 10% relief. So it is 20 plus 10, not 20 minus 15. Please look at it that way.
No, but
And I suppose,
the partially convertible rupee covers a much broader band than your EXIM script did.
No, that is the direction. In respect of most of the imports, you would have been paying about 25, 30, 22, that kind of a thing. So compared to that you gain. Add that to the
Ninan, wouldn't you say that in terms of being exposed to market forces now, I mean earlier you had to go get a license to get an import, now it's just that's
I think that's a tremendous thing. But I have a question also on expenditure, because I suspect that the real effort in this budget has been to cut expenditure. even during the current year, expenditure has been in fact contained within what the finance minister said last July. And I suspect there are major cuts in the next year too. My question would be whether these are the right kind of cuts or the wrong kind of cuts. Are we cutting social sector spending, are we cutting capital spending, or are we cutting unproductive spending? What is the pattern of expenditure cuts?
Well, let me say that I have done a bit of both. I have, of course, tried to protect the social sectors to the maximum extent possible, but most of these sectors are in the state list. There we have increased the central assistance, but that's not the only indicators. In aggregate, through taxes, through central assistance and other instrumentalities, I would be transferring about 5,000 crores more to the states. I hope that this would help the states to sustain the tempo of development in the social sectors. But I do recognize that many states' fiscal system are very much overstretched. So there are problems. And therefore, even if the central government does more, I think there are problems in adequate financing of social sector. But I did want that the states should also embark upon a path of fiscal consolidation. And I want to assist them in this effort. That's why all the resource mobilization I have done is not for the center. The benefit of it goes wholly to the states. I could have, I think, chosen a softer path, but I thought a finance minister who worries only about the union budget and forgets about the states of the union, many of these states today are in dire difficulties. I think he would not be worthy of being the finance minister of the Union of India. So therefore, I hope that the states will use these additional resources we are providing to strengthen social spending. But I certainly would have liked to do more for the social sector at the center. I think constraint of resources has, I think, hampered me. But even then, we have tried to provide, for example, considerable additional spending on family welfare, which is entirely a central finance spending.
Yes. So in fact, I wouldn't be worthy if I didn't make one small correction on a typographical error on our earlier graphic. You've not been quite as liberal as the graphic suggested. We had said that it's 450 rupees per 10 kilograms of gold that came in. It's actually 10 grams of gold that come in. I mean, I think I will have disappointed a lot of people by this small change. But there is a lot in this budget also for income tax payers. Let's quickly run down the summary of the main points for the income tax payer. Basically, the exemption limit has been raised from 22,000 to 28,000. The tax rates are now down 20% on income of up to rupees 50,000 a year, 30% up to rupees 1 lakh, and 40% over rupees 1 lakh. Of course, there is still that 12% surcharge. I even now forget what that was initially introduced for. I think it was the drought about 5 years ago. Deductions under ATL, ATCCA and ATCCB have been abolished. That's National Savings Schemes and Jeevan Dhara. They now become part of Section 88, which is the National Savings Certificates, LIC, etc. In an effort to widen the tax base, shopkeepers earning up to rupees 5 lakhs can now decide or optionally to pay only 1,400 rupees a year as tax. I mean, that is a phenomenally attractive proposition for them. I don't know if the finance minister doesn't, they obviously realize that once they're in the tax net, things may get tougher later. Incomes of children will be clubbed with parents, and there's tax relief for women whose standard deduction goes up from 12,000 to 15,000. These are working women with salaries up to 75,000 rupees. For the elderly over 65, a 10% tax rebate of net tax payable up to rupees 50,000. Kaushik, it's a budget for both the macro aspects and quite a lot in these kind of micro rationalizations, changes in individual tax rates, wealth tax, capital gains tax, etc. Where do you think is its main thrust, in the macro policies, or normally in fact part A of a budget is the dull part B is the exciting part for everybody, but this time there's a lot in part A as well.
What excites me most is the macro and the long run. a sign that this is really an economist's budget, which pleases me immensely, is that there is no attempt to cap inflation by stopping this price from rising or that price from rising, cutting down on a little bit of tax. These things would make one-shot price changes, but do not control inflation, which is a continued increase in prices. So I feel the way this goes about on inflation, that cutting down of deficit, is indeed the right way to go about. There are several micro features also which are of interest, but I feel the micro features are of immediate interest. It will hurt our pockets or be good for our pockets immediately, but the major interest is the long run. But I want to ask one micro question, which worries me a little bit, is I'm glad that 80CCA, 80CCB, these are being abolished, because these turn out to be, apart from anything else, quite regressive, because only if you're in a high tax bracket do you benefit a lot. But bringing it under 88, some of these measures, it looks equitable, because those who are paying less tax or at a lower rate, they benefit more than those who are paying at a higher rate. But those who are not paying taxes at all, they of course don't get any tax concessions from this. So it's progressive for those who are already in the tax bracket within that. But if you take the whole scheme of people, it is not very clear that it is progressive. And I would personally like to see even concessions of this kind. In the long run, there should be a scheme to remove concessions of this kind, and savings ought to be tapped much more directly.
I think I agree with that, but Kaushik, you know, in public life, many times the best easily becomes the enemy of the good. But I share your aspiration for a simpler, more credible, more transparent system of direct taxes. I think that's the direction in which I would like to move if I am there long enough.
That's an interesting question. Actually,
sorry,
there's just one question I think which is a controversial question. I think we should ask it at this point. The budget speech today was delayed by 20 minutes. I think I can't remember it ever happening before. We are told that the rest of the world, in fact, to be specific, the World Bank and the IMF knew all these provisions before we got to know about them. That's one aspect. The other is that in any case, many of the things that have been committed to the World Bank should have been informed in a more open policy to the country and to Parliament. Could you explain both these these charges?
First of all, I think there is no truth at all in the assertions that any of the budget secrets have been given to the World Bank or the IMF. I have stated today on the floor of the House that the Chalia Committee's report, which I have used for formulating my tax proposals,
substantially, yes,
substantially, was kept within the four walls of the Ministry of Finance. We have not discussed this report with the World Bank. We have not discussed this report with the IMF or any outside agency. And therefore, this charge that I have discussed any part of my financial proposals with the World Bank or the IMF is totally fallacious. I have been in the government long enough to know what is proper and what is not proper, and to expect that I do not know these elementary things, that budget secret cannot be shared with outside agencies, that I would be so foolish as to commit that mistake, I think is something which is not doing credits to my experience and knowledge of budget matters.
What about actually being more open about these
No,
commitments?
I think I would say that one learns by experience. But I would like to say that in fact it was my intention to place, just as I placed the IMF letter in the last session of Parliament, it was my intention to place this letter of development policy also along with other budget papers, because I had intended that the Chalia Committee's report and this document should be available to Parliament when they discuss our budget proposal. And I am being truthful to you. In fact, I had encouraged Ashok Desai to include both these letters of intent as the annexures to the economic survey. But somehow at the last stage I thought maybe we should do it after the budget. I could have done it earlier, but it was not my intention to keep anything from the people of India. But I have to worry about the functioning of the government, because many of the discussions, negotiations with other agencies, including other governments, under our constitution, government have the right to enter into agreements. Parliament, when these things impinge on its authority, has the right to reject or to approve. But if I were to say that any transactions that I do with the World Bank or the IMF must be placed before Parliament or it must have parliamentary approval, I think, I say it in all respect, that would make the functioning of government impossible. If, for example, during negotiations the officials of the Ministry of Finance are always hampered, that this document that they are negotiating will be criticized by Mr. Chandrasekhar in Parliament for reasons which are known to him, many of my young officers would duck. They would like to write letters of intent which the other side would simply reject, because they would like to play safe. So I think the functioning of government in this country would be rendered difficult if we were to make it into an absolute law that all discussions, all negotiation with the IMF and the World Bank ought to be, I think, made available to Parliament. So those matters which are the concern of Parliament, they should be brought to Parliament in due course. And let me say that what we have done in no way infringes the sovereignty of India or the rights of Parliament. If the Government of India takes a view that a certain thing which is mentioned as a condition is not acceptable to us, we are perfectly free to reject. If the Parliament of India feels that a particular thing which we have said to the World Bank and it requires legislative action, we will go to Parliament anyway, and Parliament has the right to say, well, we don't agree, in which case all that happens is that we simply don't collect our money. And therefore all these false charges that are being made that we have compromised the sovereignty of India, the integrity of India, are totally fallacious. Many of these gentlemen do not know, I think, what the corporate world is alike, what the world economy today is, how it functions, the constraint under which developing countries operate. And let me say, I would like to say this thing, several people have been accusing me of intellectual dishonesty, that I wrote the World Bank, that I wrote the South Commission's report, and what I am now doing as Finance Minister is very different. Personally, I feel if you can read the South Commission's report intelligently, what I am doing, everything is there. But let me say, even if it were not there, there I was the servant of 33 commissioners. Here I am the Finance Minister of India. It is my primary duty here is to defend the interests and integrity of India. And if what I have to do in that process is to disown some of the views which I have held in the past, I am duty bound to do that. I am not so proud to say that what I said 15 years ago must have priority over what I consider to be the interests of the nation.
Yes, sir.
These are the considerations which have guided me.
But one of the fears that I think you've in fact accepted that through experience, perhaps one could have been a little more open about it. One, as an ordinary citizen, the secrecy that is so obsessive with the government today and the lack of openness seems to have filtered through somewhat. And I think, as you said, perhaps through experience one could have been a little more open. Ninan, you had a question on the Chile.
Yeah, well, I was coming back to the whole question of direct taxes, which is that the Finance Minister has said that he wants to widen the tax net and rope more people into the income tax net. And he's mentioned that there are only 7 million income taxpayers in a country of 850 million people. In that context, I frankly don't understand why he has done two things. Number one is to raise the minimum tax exemption floor from 22,000 to 28,000, and why he has abolished the tax reduction at source scheme for interest and commission payments. Because these are methods of roping more people into the tax net. You can, to adjust for inflation at that low income level, cut the tax rate. If it was 20% before, make it 10%, make it even 5%. But don't get them out of the tax net. Similarly with the TDS scheme, you could have enlarged its scope to bring more people into the tax net instead of narrowing its base.
But it has caused a lot of resentment, and I have said that in my budget speech. I was convinced that what we did last year to introduce the TDS was the right thing. But a finance minister has to be sensitive to the feelings of the people, and if you took a vote in Parliament, I think 90% of the members of Parliament were of the view that this was a wrong decision. They told me so. and I therefore respect the feelings of members of parliament. As regards the raising of the exemption limit, I think you have a valid point that I could have dealt with the same thing by maybe by lowering the threshold tax rate. But here also I think the popular feeling in all political parties has been that the income tax rates have to be, exemption limits have to be raised. And as you know, I have been accused by some of the journalists of political naivety. I am learning very fast, and I think the political mood of the country was that the exemption limit should be raised.
Well, let's hope you don't learn too fast on political matters, because sometimes they can derail economic sense. But now, while we're on taxes, let's have a quick look at this budget and what it has in store on taxes. On other taxes, double taxation on partnerships has been removed. That's another major irritant that's been around for a long time. Tax at source on bank interest, as we've just discussed, has been withdrawn. Wealth tax, now shares, bonds and deposits, these are considered to be productive investments because they are used in commercial activity, are now out of the wealth tax considerations. But other assets over 15 lakhs will now be taxed at 1%. It used to, of course, be a maximum of 2% earlier. Major changes in capital gains tax as well. If we can have a quick look at that. We have the cost of assets now will be adjusted with inflation. Actually, I would like some clarifications of this. The tax rates have been changed, now 20% for individuals and 40% for companies. And exemptions under section 54E and 53 removed, including residential. Montek, if I can bring you in this case, house owners on capital gains tax. What exactly do these provisions imply?
What will happen is that a house owner who sells his house will be deducting from the gross realization of the sale an amount which will not be just the cost of acquisition, but that cost indexed up by inflation. Now, the factor for indexation will be announced by the Department of Revenue, and that will enable you, if you've held an asset for a long time, to take some advantage because of the inflation. So the amount of capital gain computed will be less because of this inflation, and it will be a larger gain if you've held the asset for a long time. I mean, the problem with the present system was that it wasn't connected with the period of time that you held the asset. So in that sense, people who've held an asset for a long time will have a better treatment, whereas those who make a gain after a very short period will pay more tax.
But there is a problem there, which I may point out, is that you have said that shares are exempt from wealth tax, if I get it right,
Yes.
because they are productive assets. But the finance minister in his speech has described housing as unproductive assets. I'm not sure how this is the case.
Only residential houses beyond certain.
They're not unproductive.
No, but I think if somebody builds a palace, I think. And I would also like to say that there is a provision in the Income Tax Act which says that if you sell a house and use the proceeds to buy another house, I think you don't have to pay income tax. I think that provision remains.
Oh, I see. So you can still reinvest.
That
rollover
remains. That's
what is called a rollover.
I see.
Is still there. You sell a house, invest the proceeds in another house.
Yes.
It doesn't come under that net.
I see. So that doesn't come under that.
This is a much more simpler system, administratively far less cumbersome, and I think honest assessees would find it much more profitable to pay the tax rather than to adopt various devious routes to
Dharam, leaving the stocks and shares out of wealth taxes, of course, a major boost to the share market. There have also been several other measures on the share market. If we can quickly run through those before you comment on that. Shares have, of course, as we just mentioned, been exempt from wealth tax. Mutual funds have also been exempt from income tax. That gives them a major advantage. Tax treatment of long-term capital gains has changed, as we've just talked. That's going to be indexed to the rate of inflation. Foreign investment may be allowed in Indian shares. That's by reputable companies, as you say, like pension funds and mutual funds abroad. And government is no longer to control the share issues and premiums. The Controller of Capital Issues office is virtually defunct. Perhaps it's got some queuing and ordering issues to do, but a major problem used to be the pricing of shares of new issues. They'd be priced so low by the Controller of Capital Issues, they'd be oversubscribed 30, 40, sometimes 100 times. And that whole area seems to be, I think there's legislation got to be enacted still too, but that is definite government policy now?
Yes, I have announced it that we are going to abolish the Office of the Controller of Capital Issues.
The whole office will be abolished.
The regulatory functions would be transferred to the SEBI, but that does not mean that SEBI would be doing the work of the Controller of Capital Issues. There will be prudential norms, guidelines. Subject to that, companies can price the issues which the market will bear.
Dharan.
Prannoy, I think most of what you've said is very good news, and I think the capital market, stock market reaction is a reflection of that. One point which we have been seeking for a couple of years and which has come through and which we are very grateful for is that the public sector and the private sector will be treated on par in regard to both mutual funds and also the VRS. This has been an anomaly over the last few years. But generally here these are all positive signs, and I think industry will welcome a lesser role for the Controller of Capital Issues. In any case, I think we are seeking to get away from regulation and get into a competitive environment. We've had a tough year, we are going to continue to have a tough year, maybe 2 more tough years. We hope in the process to build up exports and get out of the recessionary trends. But by and large, things are looking
positive. Kaushik, you were talking about the macro aspects of this whole budget, and one of the most interesting things which I think all of us to some extent owe an apology to you, because we were very skeptical about your promises on the fiscal deficit. Now on the fiscal deficit, and we're going to ask you how exactly you've achieved this. In last year it's come down from about 44,000 crores, which was 8.4% of GDP, down to 6.2% in our calculations. That's well below the IMF targets of 6.5. And next year, I still refused not to be skeptical, but it's around 5% or 5.1%. That's 34,000 crores. Kaushik, did you really expect these kind of targets to be met? Because they are major reductions.
The current year's one, I was expecting a sharp reduction. The coming year, in the light of the industrial recession, I felt that we would aim for something a little larger than 5%. In fact, in my opinion, that perhaps would have been even judicious to aim for something a little over 5%. With this deficit, Prannoy, I have one question,
yes,
slight
yes.
disobedience. I'm taking it off in a slightly different
Please,
direction.
please go ahead.
There are 2 things I was expecting with more or less the same deficit, which I don't really see adequately here, and I want to know whether you have plans or not. You know, despite 45 years of so-called pro-poor budgets, the amount that India spends on health and education is less than what a thriving capitalist economy like South Korea does in terms of percentage of government expenditure. India spends about 5%, South Korea spends about 22-23%, similarly Thailand 25%. I would have expected that moves would be made to go for a much bigger expenditure on this, and a matching cut in waste in government expenditure would also be on the plan. For instance, preventing just any further recruitment, as Raja Chalaya's calculations show, would save us something like 1,800 crores, and some of this could have been shifted over, I felt.
Well, I think Raja is one of our greatest economists. I think he has done outstanding work in this committee. I hate to take up an issue with him, but my finance secretary tells me that his calculations, and I say it with all respect, his calculations in this respect are a bit little off the mark. These estimates of what savings you can make through changes in recruitment. Would you like to explain?
Can I supplement it, sir? You see, people feel that there is a lot of scope for cutting expenditure in government staff. That is because we have a total of about 54 lakhs, and it costs us about 17,000 crores. What they forget is, in defense we have about 15 lakhs. We are not willing to come forward and sort of say that the defense should be brought down from 15 to 10 lakhs. And then the 54 lakhs includes about 18 lakhs in the railways, which is a commercial service. It includes about 10 lakhs in post and telegraphs, and another about 6 lakhs in the defense ordnance. What is left of the basic primary government, which is where we say you don't have to do this function, you can cut it, is just 6 lakhs of people. The total salary budget will be no more than 3,000. So when you say we can stop recruitment, because it is not anybody's thesis that you can send back home half of them. You stop recruitment, you save about 3%, 2% in a year, you end up with a much smaller figure. I am not trying to say that the suggestion is wrong. This is precisely what we have been trying to do in the government in the last few years. This is what we want to do in a more orchestrated manner in the future. But the order of saving that you are expecting will be much less in this, and unless you tackle subsidies, there is no way you are going to reduce expenditure. The only cut will be on the planned budget support.
Yes, but
Well,
you know,
Geeta, I'm sorry, you've
Running
got
out
the
of
last
time.
word because we're totally out of time. We're running into the news time. In fact, I think we could carry on this forever, all night. But it's been a pleasure to be here at a historic budget. And as you said, if it's implemented well, the Prime Minister said, if it's implemented well, India will be on a new path. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Prannoy.